The day was gray, the kind of gray that felt heavy in the air like a blanket pressing down on everyone's shoulders. The sky seemed undecided, half-heartedly drizzling rain one moment and then holding back the next, as if it couldn't quite figure out how to mourn properly either. At the small church on Maple Street, people filed in quietly, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground outside. Each face carried its own version of sadness, but none more so than Emily Dawson's. Emily stood near the front pew, clutching a worn photograph tightly in her hands. It was an old picture creased at the edges from years of being tucked into pockets or left lying around. In it, she was 6 years old, sitting atop her father's broad shoulders, both of them laughing with wide-open mouths. She remembered that day vividly, the summer sun warming her skin, the sound of her dad's deep chuckle vibrating through his chest, the way he'd swung her up onto his shoulders without even breaking a sweat. Back then, life had felt endless, full of possibilities. But now everything felt broken, shattered beyond repair. Her father, Mark Dawson, wasn't supposed to leave this soon. He was only 42, strong and full of energy, always ready with a joke or a helping hand. Everyone knew him as the guy who fixed leaky faucets for neighbors, coached Little League on weekends, and never hesitated to run into danger when duty called. As a firefighter, he'd saved countless lives over the years, earning medals and accolades that hung proudly on the walls of their modest home. But last week, fate had decided it was his turn to be the hero one final time. And this time, it cost him everything. Mark had been inside a burning apartment building, trying to rescue a trapped child. Witnesses said he charged in without hesitation, ignoring the flames licking hungrily at the walls. When he finally emerged, coughing and covered in soot, the little boy was cradled safely in his arms. But moments later, part of the roof collapsed, trapping Mark beneath fiery debris. By the time his fellow firefighters pulled him out, it was too late. His heart had stopped beating. Now here they were, a congregation gathered not to celebrate his life but to say goodbye. The church was packed, filled with friends, co-workers, and strangers who'd heard about his bravery and wanted to pay their respects. Some cried openly, others stared straight ahead, their faces pale and drawn. Emily didn't notice any of them. To her, the room might as well have been empty. All she could focus on was the polished wooden box at the front of the church, draped in flowers and ribbons. Inside that box lay her father, or what remained of him. The thought made her stomach twist painfully. "Emily," her mother whispered, softly placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Come sit down." Sarah Dawson looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy from days of crying. Still, she tried to hold herself together for her daughter's sake. She guided Emily to the front pew where they sat side by side, neither speaking. Emily kept staring at the casket, unable to tear her gaze away. Her mind raced with memories, playing catch in the backyard, baking cookies together during snowstorms, reading bedtime stories until her voice grew hoarse. How could someone so alive, so present, suddenly be gone? As the service began, a pastor stepped up to the podium and started talking about Mark's courage, his selflessness, his unwavering dedication to helping others. His words blurred together in Emily's ears, meaningless syllables lost in the fog of grief. She barely registered when people stood to share their own stories, how Mark had helped rebuild a neighbor's porch after a storm, how he'd stayed late at work to ensure everyone got home safely, how he'd once driven 2 hours in the middle of the night just to fix a stranger's car. These anecdotes painted a portrait of a man larger than life. Yet all Emily could think about was how small and quiet the world felt without him. When it came time for the eulogy, Sarah rose shakily to her feet. Her voice trembled as she spoke, recounting cherished moments from their marriage and thanking everyone for their support. "He was my rock," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "And now I don't know how we'll go on without him." Emily reached out instinctively, gripping her mother's hand tightly. For the first time in days, Sarah smiled faintly, squeezing back before returning to her seat. Finally, the moment arrived that everyone had been dreading, the procession to the cemetery. Pallbearers carried the casket outside, followed by a solemn line of mourners. Emily walked numbly beside her mother, her legs moving automatically as though disconnected from her body. Raindrops began to fall again, dotting her hair and clothes, but she barely noticed. Everything around her felt distant, surreal, like she was watching herself from far away. At the gravesite, the casket was lowered slowly into the earth. One by one, people stepped forward to toss handfuls of dirt onto it, symbolically bidding farewell. Emily watched them mechanically, her heart pounding louder with each passing second. Something inside her snapped. She couldn't bear to see the lid close over her father forever. Without thinking, she broke free from her mother's grasp and ran toward the grave. "No," she screamed, her voice raw and desperate. Falling to her knees beside the casket, she threw her arms around it, hugging it fiercely as if she could will him back to life. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the rain soaking her clothes. "Daddy, please don't leave me," she sobbed, her words muffled against the cold wood. "I need you, please come back." For a moment, the entire world seemed to freeze. The murmurs of the crowd faded into silence, replaced by the steady patter of rain hitting the ground. Emily clung to the casket, her tiny frame trembling with sobs. No one moved to stop her. They simply stood there, frozen in shock, unsure of what to do next. And then, something extraordinary happened. As Emily hugged the casket with all her might, a strange sensation rippled through the air. At first it was subtle, a faint breeze that seemed to come from nowhere, brushing against the mourners' faces despite the stillness of the day. Then, without warning, the sky above them darkened dramatically. The soft drizzle turned into a sudden gust of wind, swirling around the gravesite like an invisible force. Leaves rustled violently and umbrellas were yanked out of people's hands, tumbling across the wet grass. Everyone froze, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What's happening?" someone whispered, but no one dared to move or speak loudly. It felt as though nature itself had paused, holding its breath along with the crowd. The golden afternoon sunlight that had filtered through the clouds moments ago vanished completely, replaced by an eerie twilight glow. And then, something even more astonishing occurred. A faint, shimmering light began to emanate from the casket. The light wasn't harsh or blinding. It was warm and soft, almost like sunlight breaking through water. It pulsed gently, growing brighter with each passing second. Gasps echoed among the mourners as they shielded their eyes, unsure whether what they were witnessing was real or some trick of the mind. Emily, still clinging to the casket, didn't notice the light at first. She was too consumed by her grief, her tears streaming freely down her cheeks. But when the lid of the casket suddenly burst open with a loud crack, she stumbled backward in shock, landing hard on the damp ground. For a moment, there was absolute silence. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, slowly, Mark Dawson sat up inside the casket, blinking in confusion as he looked around at the stunned faces surrounding him. His clothes were disheveled, his face pale, but otherwise, he appeared unharmed. What happened?" he asked weakly, his voice hoarse and trembling. Pandemonium erupted instantly. People screamed, some backing away in terror, while others rushed forward to help. Paramedics who had been standing nearby sprang into action, pushing through the crowd to reach Mark. They checked his pulse, listened to his heart, and examined his body for any signs of injury. To their astonishment, everything seemed normal. His vitals were stable, his breathing steady. There were no marks on his skin, no indication that he had been dead for days. It was as if he had simply fallen asleep and woken up again. "Sir, can you tell us your name?" one of the paramedics asked cautiously, trying to keep his voice calm despite the chaos unfolding around them. "Mark Dawson," he replied, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Why am I here? Where's Emily?" At the mention of her name, Emily pushed past the paramedics and threw herself into her father's arms. Her sobs returned, but this time they were filled with relief and joy rather than despair. "Daddy," she cried, burying her face in his chest. "You're alive. You're Really alive. Mark wrapped his arms tightly around his daughter, rocking her back and forth as tears welled up in his own eyes. He couldn't explain how he had gotten there or why he was suddenly awake, but none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was the feel of Emily's small body pressed against his, the sound of her voice calling him Daddy once more. The scene quickly became overwhelming. Reporters who had been covering the funeral for local news outlets scrambled to capture footage of the miraculous event. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward Mark, and questions came at him from every direction. How do you feel? Do you remember dying? Is this a miracle? Mark raised a hand to shield his eyes, overwhelmed by the attention. Sarah, who had been frozen in place during the initial commotion, finally snapped out of her daze and hurried to her husband's side. Mark, she said, her voice shaking. Is it really you? He nodded, reaching out to take her hand. Sarah, I don't know what's going on, but yes, it's me. The paramedics insisted on transporting Mark to the hospital for further evaluation, despite his protests that he felt fine. As they loaded him into an ambulance, Emily refused to let go of his hand, climbing into the vehicle beside him. Sarah followed close behind. Clutch used to drive recklessly fast, weaving through traffic to get to the hospital as quickly as possible. Inside the ambulance, the atmosphere was tense yet surreal. Mark kept asking questions. How long had he been gone? What exactly had happened at the fire? But neither Sarah nor Emily could answer him coherently. Their minds were racing, struggling to process the impossible events of the past hour. When they arrived at the hospital, doctors swarmed around Mark, running tests and scans to determine his condition. Blood work, X-rays, MRIs. Everything came back perfectly normal. There was no trace of trauma, no sign of brain damage, nothing that would explain how a man declared clinically dead could suddenly wake up as though nothing had happened. One doctor suggested it might be a case of mistaken diagnosis, but the medical records clearly showed that Mark's heart had stopped beating for nearly 10 minutes before he was pronounced dead. Another speculated that perhaps Mark had entered a rare state of suspended animation, but even that theory couldn't account for the dramatic way he had awakened. Word of the miracle spread rapidly. By evening, news outlets across the country were reporting on the story. Social media exploded with speculation, prayers and theories ranging from divine intervention to scientific anomalies. Some religious groups hailed Mark's resurrection as proof of God's power, organizing prayer vigils outside the hospital. Skeptics argued that the entire incident must have been staged, accusing the family of orchestrating a publicity stunt. Strangers began showing up at the hospital, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had defied death. Despite the whirlwind of attention, the Dawson family remained secluded in Mark's hospital room. They clung to each other, trying to make sense of what had happened. Emily sat curled up in a chair beside her father's bed, refusing to leave his side. Sarah paced nervously, glancing out the window every few minutes to check for reporters lurking outside. Mark, meanwhile, alternated between staring blankly at the ceiling and asking endless questions about the days he had missed. I don't understand, he said quietly, rubbing his temples. The last thing I remember is being in the building, and then nothing. Just darkness. Sarah knelt beside his bed, taking his hand in hers. Whatever it was, we're just glad you're back, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We thought we'd lost you forever. As night fell, the hospital grew quieter, though the hum of activity never fully ceased. The Dawsons stayed, awake long after visiting hours ended, talking in hushed tones about the future. For now, they chose not to dwell on the unanswered questions, the hows and whys of Mark's return. Instead, they focused on the present, grateful for the second chance they had been given. The days following Mark's miraculous return were a blur of emotions, questions, and adjustments. For Emily, having her father back felt like waking up from a nightmare to find everything restored, except it wasn't quite that simple. Life didn't immediately go back to normal. Instead, it took on a strange new rhythm, one filled with uncertainty and wonder. Mark himself struggled to adapt to being alive again. He often described feeling like a ghost haunting his own life, as though he didn't fully belong in the world anymore. At first, the family tried to act as if nothing unusual had happened. They ate meals together at the kitchen table, watched TV in the evenings, and even attempted to resume their old routines. But there was an unspoken tension beneath the surface. Mark's presence was both a blessing and a burden. While Emily clung to him desperately, terrified of losing him again, Sarah wrestled with mixed feelings. She was overjoyed to have her husband back, but she couldn't shake the nagging doubts about what this miracle really meant, or whether it would last. One evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Sarah sat across from Mark at the dining room table. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. Sarah stared at her hands, twisting them nervously in her lap before finally speaking. "Mark," she began hesitantly, "do you ever feel different?" He looked up from the newspaper he'd been pretending to read. "Different how?" he asked, setting it aside. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Like maybe you're not supposed to be here." Her words hung heavy in the air between them. Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples thoughtfully. "I've thought about that too," he confessed. "Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and think, what if this is all just borrowed time? Or worse, what if something's wrong with me? What if I'm not really me anymore?" Sarah reached out to take his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're still you," she said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "I can see it in your eyes, hear it in your laugh. You're my Mark." But deep down, she wasn't entirely sure. Since his return, Mark had exhibited subtle changes, things that only someone who knew him intimately would notice. He seemed more introspective, quieter than before. His jokes, once a constant source of laughter in their home, now came less frequently. And then there were the moments when he'd stare off into space, lost in thought, as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. When Sarah asked him about these episodes, he brushed them off, saying he was just tired or distracted. But she couldn't ignore the growing sense that something fundamental had shifted within him. For Emily, however, none of that mattered. To her, her father was simply Dad, the man who taught her how to ride a bike, who cheered her on during school plays, who tucked her in at night with silly bedtime stories. Having him back filled the void in her heart that had felt impossible to heal. Every morning she woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to make the most of every moment they had together. She followed him around the house like a shadow, asking him to play games, help her with homework, or just sit and talk. At times her enthusiasm bordered on overwhelming, but Mark never complained. If anything, he cherished her boundless energy, seeing it as proof that life was worth fighting for. Their bond grew stronger than ever during those weeks. They spent hours talking about everything and nothing, Emily sharing snippets of her day at school, Mark recounting memories from his childhood. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch swing, Emily pulled out the worn photograph she'd carried to the funeral. "Remember this?" she asked, holding it up for him to see. Mark smiled softly, taking the picture from her. "Of course I do," he said, running his thumb over the faded image. "That was a good day." "Do you think we'll have more days like that?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with hope. Mark hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Absolutely," he replied, pulling her close. "We'll make plenty more." Despite their efforts to focus on the positives, the outside world continued to intrude. Reporters camped outside their house day and night, eager for updates on the miracle man. Strangers knocked on their door, asking for interviews, blessings, or explanations. Some claimed Mark's resurrection was a sign from God, while others accused the family of orchestrating a hoax. The constant attention wore on them, making it hard to step outside without being bombarded by cameras and microphones. To escape the chaos, the Dawsons decided to spend a weekend at a secluded cabin owned by one of Mark's firefighter friends. Nestled deep in the woods, far away from prying eyes, it offered them a rare opportunity to reconnect as a family. As they drove up the winding dirt road, Emily pressed her face against the car window, marveling at the towering trees and crisp autumn air. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly happy. The cabin was cozy and rustic, with a crackling fireplace and shelves lined with books. That first night, they roasted marshmallows over the fire, laughing as they burned their fingers trying to eat the gooey treats. Mark told ghost stories, his deep voice sending shivers down Emily's spine. Later, wrapped in blankets under a starry sky, they talked about their dreams for the future. Emily wanted to become an artist, painting pictures so beautiful they made people cry. Mark joked that he might retire early and open a fishing lodge. Even Sarah allowed herself to dream a little, imagining lazy summer afternoons spent gardening or reading novels on the porch. Yet despite the peaceful surroundings, the weight of unanswered questions lingered in the corners of their minds. On the second night, as Emily lay curled up in bed, she overheard her parents arguing in hushed tones downstairs. Curious, she tiptoed to the top of the stairs and listened. "We can't keep ignoring this," Sarah whispered urgently. "People are going to want answers eventually. What happens when the doctors can't explain it? What happens when the media starts digging deeper?" "And what do you want me to say, Sarah?" Mark shot back, frustration creeping into his voice. "I don't have any answers. I don't know why I came back, I just did." "But what if it's not permanent?" Sarah countered. "What if something goes wrong again? We need to prepare ourselves." "No," Mark interrupted sharply. "I'm not going to live in fear, not after everything we've been through. Whatever happens, we'll face it together as a family." Their voices softened after that, muffled by distance and the crackle of the dying fire. Emily crept back to her room, her heart pounding. She understood her mother's concerns, but she also shared her father's determination to move forward. Lying awake long into the night, she made a silent promise. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she would fight to keep her family whole. When they returned home from the cabin, things felt slightly better, at least for a while. The reporters thinned out and the phone calls slowed to a trickle. Slowly, the Dawsons began rebuilding their lives, piece by fragile piece. They attended therapy sessions together, learning how to navigate the complex emotions brought on by Mark's return. Emily poured her feelings into art, creating vibrant paintings that captured the beauty and pain of their journey. Sarah threw herself into work, channeling her anxieties into productivity. And Mark? He spent his days cherishing the little things, the warmth of sunlight on his face, the sound of birds chirping in the morning, the feel of his daughter's hand in his. But even as they embraced their newfound normalcy, a lingering question remained. Was Mark's return truly a miracle, or something far more complicated? As weeks turned into months, the initial shock of Mark's return began to fade, for some people at least. To the outside world, life for the Dawson family appeared to be settling back into a comfortable rhythm. The media circus had largely moved on, leaving them alone in their quiet suburban home. Neighbors stopped whispering behind closed doors, and strangers no longer knocked on their door seeking answers or blessings. But beneath the surface, unsettling questions continued to gnaw at the edges of their lives. It started with small things, odd occurrences that could easily be dismissed as coincidence or stress. One night, Emily woke up screaming, her face pale and streaked with tears. When Sarah rushed into her room, she found her daughter sitting upright in bed, clutching her blanket tightly. "They were pulling him down," Emily sobbed, pointing toward the window. "I saw them." "Who, sweetheart?" Sarah asked gently, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Who was pulling him down?" "The shadows," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Daddy, they were taking him away." Sarah tried to comfort her, telling her it was just a bad dream. But when she mentioned the incident to Mark the next morning, he didn't dismiss it so quickly. Instead, his expression darkened, and he admitted something troubling. He'd been having nightmares too. In his dreams, he stood on the edge of an endless void, surrounded by shadowy figures reaching out to drag him downward. He always woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, the feeling of those phantom hands lingering on his skin long after he opened his eyes. These episodes became more frequent, casting a shadow over their fragile sense of normalcy. During the day, Mark seemed distracted, often zoning out during conversations or staring blankly at walls. At first, Sarah thought he was simply tired from adjusting to being alive again. But one evening, while putting dishes away in the kitchen, she noticed him standing motionless in the doorway, his eyes wide with fear. "Mark?" she called softly, setting the plate in her hand aside. "Are you okay?" He blinked rapidly, as if snapping out of a trance. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." But Sarah wasn't convinced. Over dinner that night, she pressed him for details about what was really going on. Reluctantly, Mark confessed that he'd been experiencing moments of disorientation, not just in his dreams but during waking hours as well. Sometimes sounds would fade away entirely, leaving him in eerie silence. Other times he swore he could hear whispers coming from empty rooms, voices speaking words he couldn't quite make out. The most disturbing part? These experiences always left him with a deep, unshakable feeling that he didn't fully belong in this world anymore. Emily noticed the changes too, though she didn't fully understand them. Her father still played games with her and helped her with homework, but there were moments when he seemed distant, almost like a stranger wearing his face. One afternoon, while coloring together at the kitchen table, she looked up at him and asked, "Daddy, are you happy to be here?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment he hesitated, searching for the right words. Finally, he smiled softly and ruffled her hair. "Of course I am, kiddo. Being here with you and Mom is everything I ever wanted." But later that night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the doubt creeping into his mind. Was he truly meant to stay? Or had he been given a second chance only to fulfill some greater purpose? Meanwhile, whispers of doubt spread beyond the walls of their home. Despite the lull in media attention, rumors about Mark's resurrection continued to circulate. Some neighbors whispered that he might not be entirely human, that perhaps whatever brought him back had altered him in ways they couldn't comprehend. Others speculated that his return was a sign of impending doom, a harbinger of something darker looming on the horizon. A few religious groups even claimed his revival was proof of divine intervention, urging the Dawsons to share their story publicly as a testament to faith and miracles. These theories weighed heavily on Sarah, who struggled to reconcile her gratitude for Mark's return with her growing unease. She tried to ignore the gossip, focusing instead on keeping their family grounded. Still, late at night, when everyone else was asleep, she found herself scrolling through online forums where strangers debated the nature of Mark's miracle. Some posts praised him as a symbol of hope. Others accused him of being a fraud or worse, an abomination. Reading these comments made her chest tighten with anxiety, and she couldn't help but wonder if the truth might lie somewhere in between. One particularly tense evening, the tension boiled over. After tucking Emily into bed, Sarah confronted Mark about whether they should seek professional help, not just for his physical health but for his mental state as well. "You're not yourself lately," she said bluntly, pacing the living room floor. "And I'm scared, Mark. Scared for you, scared for us. What if something's wrong? What if this miracle has strings attached?" Mark sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I know you're worried, Sarah. Believe me, I am too. But how do we even begin to explain this to someone? Do we tell them I died and came back? That I see shadows and hear voices? They'll lock me up in a lab faster than you can blink. And what if that's exactly what we need?" She shot back, her voice rising. "What if there's a reason why this happened? A scientific explanation we haven't considered yet? We owe it to ourselves, and to Emily, to find out." Her words struck a nerve. For the first time since his return, Mark allowed himself to consider the possibility that his survival might not have been random. Perhaps there was a reason he'd been given another chance. Maybe understanding it could provide closure or protection for his family. Reluctantly, he agreed to visit a specialist recommended by one of his former colleagues, Dr. Evelyn Carter, a renowned neuroscientist known for her research on near-death experiences. The appointment was scheduled for the following week, and in the days leading up to it, the atmosphere in the house grew tense. Emily sensed the shift immediately. Her parents' hushed conversations and worried glances told her something big was happening, though neither of them offered any explanations. Desperate for answers, she decided to take matters into her own hands. One rainy afternoon, while her parents were busy preparing dinner, Emily snuck into her father's study. It was a small room cluttered with books, old photographs, and mementos from his firefighting career. As she rummaged through the shelves, her fingers brushed against something tucked away in the corner, a leather-bound journal. Intrigued, she pulled it out and flipped it open, recognizing her father's handwriting instantly. The entries revealed a side of Mark she'd never seen before. They spoke of his fears of failing as a husband and father, of leaving his family behind too soon. In one particularly poignant passage, he wrote about the fire that ultimately claimed his life. "If today is my last day, I hope they remember me not as a hero, but as someone who loved them fiercely. Someone who would do anything to keep them safe." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she read the words. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Her father's struggles weren't just about surviving. They were about belonging, about proving to himself that he deserved this second chance. Clutching the journal to her chest, she quietly returned it to its spot and slipped out of the room, her heart heavy with newfound understanding. When she joined her parents at the dinner table later that night, she reached across and grabbed both of their hands. "No matter what happens," she said firmly, "we're a team, right? We stick together." Mark and Sarah exchanged a glance, then nodded, smiling despite the uncertainty hanging over them. For now, that was enough. The day of Mark's appointment with Dr. Evelyn Carter arrived, and the entire Dawson family felt a mix of anticipation and dread. Emily had insisted on coming along, clutching her father's hand tightly as they walked into the sleek, modern building where Dr. Carter worked. The office was filled with strange machines that hummed softly, their screens displaying charts and graphs that none of them could decipher. It all felt clinical and cold, a stark contrast to the warmth they tried so hard to hold on to at home. Dr. Carter greeted them warmly, her calm demeanor putting everyone slightly at ease. She was a tall woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through people, but also carried an air of kindness. After introductions were made, she led them to a private room where she began by asking Mark to recount his experience, the fire, his death, and his unexpected return. Mark hesitated at first, unsure how much detail to share, but eventually he opened up about everything: the darkness, the shadows pulling him downward, and the overwhelming sense of peace before waking up in the casket. As he spoke, Dr. Carter listened intently, jotting down notes occasionally. When he finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "What you've described isn't entirely unheard of," she explained. "Many individuals who have survived near-death experiences report similar sensations, feelings of detachment, encounters with shadowy figures, or even moments of profound clarity. However," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "your case is unique because you weren't merely revived after being clinically dead for a short period. You were declared deceased for nearly 10 minutes without any medical intervention. That makes your situation extraordinary." Mark swallowed, hard, glancing at Sarah and Emily, who sat silently beside him. "Does that mean something's wrong with me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter shook her head. "Not necessarily, but I'd like to run some tests to better understand what might be happening in your brain. These episodes of disorientation, the whispers you hear, they could be linked to heightened neural activity or even residual effects from crossing over into, well, whatever lies beyond." Her explanation sent a chill down everyone's spines, though no one dared to say it aloud. Over the next few hours, Mark underwent a battery of examinations: MRI scans, EEGs, cognitive assessments, and reflex tests. Each procedure left him feeling more drained than the last, yet he endured them quietly, determined to find answers. For himself, for his family. Sarah stayed close throughout, holding his hand whenever possible, while Emily wandered the halls, outside peering curiously at the equipment and staff. When the results finally came back, Dr. Carter called them into her office. Her expression was unreadable as she spread out the scans and reports across her desk. "There's good news and complicated news," she began cautiously. "Physically, you're in excellent health. Your heart, lungs, and other vital organs show no signs of damage or abnormality. Mentally, however, there are anomalies we can't fully explain." She pointed to one of the MRI images, highlighting areas of Mark's brain that glowed brighter than normal. These regions correspond to memory processing and sensory perception. They're unusually active, far beyond what we typically observe in healthy individuals. It's almost as if your brain is trying to process information from somewhere else. "Somewhere else?" Sarah echoed, her voice trembling. "What does that mean?" Dr. Carter leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together. "It's difficult to say definitively. Some scientists theorize that near-death experiences allow the mind to access dimensions or realms outside our understanding. Others believe these sensations are simply hallucinations caused by stress or trauma. In your husband's case," she hesitated again, then added, "I think it's possible he may still be partially connected to whatever state he entered during those critical moments when he was pronounced dead." The room fell silent as her words sank in. Emily looked up at her father, wide-eyed. "So, Daddy's still partway there, eh?" she asked softly. "In a manner of speaking, yes," Dr. Carter replied gently. "But that doesn't mean he's lost to us. On the contrary, his presence here suggests an incredibly strong connection to life, to love, to this family. Whatever brought him back clearly values those bonds deeply." Though her explanation offered some comfort, it also raised more questions. If Mark was still tethered to another realm, did that mean he might leave again? And if so, how could they prevent it? Dr. Carter admitted she didn't have all the answers but recommended ongoing therapy and monitoring to help manage his symptoms. She also suggested journaling as a way for Mark to document his experiences, hoping it might reveal patterns or triggers. Back at home, the Dawsons processed the visit in different ways. Mark spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying Dr. Carter's words in his mind. Was he truly walking a line between two worlds? If so, what was expected of him? He remembered the fire vividly now, the heat, the smoke, the child's terrified face, and wondered if saving others was somehow tied to his purpose. Maybe he hadn't been brought back just for himself, but to continue helping those in need. Sarah, meanwhile, wrestled with guilt and fear. She loved having Mark home, but the uncertainty gnawed at her constantly. What if he disappeared again? How would she explain it to Emily? Late at night, she found herself praying, not to any specific deity, but to whatever force had given her husband a second chance. "Please keep him safe," she whispered into the darkness. "We'll do anything, just let him stay." Emily, ever the optimist, focused on cherishing every moment with her father. Inspired by Dr. Carter's suggestion, she encouraged him to start writing in a journal, bringing him a fresh notebook adorned with stars and planets. "You can write about anything," she told him earnestly, "even the scary stuff. Maybe it'll help us figure things out." Mark smiled at her enthusiasm and promised to give it a try. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, he opened the notebook and began to write. At first, the words came haltingly, but soon he found himself pouring out thoughts and feelings he hadn't realized he'd been holding inside. He wrote about the fire, the shadows, the dreams that haunted him. He wrote about his fears of leaving his family again and his gratitude for being alive. Most importantly, he wrote about the love that bound them together, a force stronger than death itself. As the days passed, Mark noticed something remarkable. The act of writing seemed to ease his anxiety. The nightmares grew less frequent, and the whispers faded into silence. For the first time since his return, he felt grounded, anchored not by science or religion, but by the simple truth that he belonged with his family. Sarah noticed the change, too, watching as his shoulders relaxed and his laughter returned. Even Emily seemed lighter, skipping through the house with renewed energy. One afternoon, As they sat together in the backyard under the shade of an old oak tree, Emily turned to her father and asked, "Do you think you'll ever go back to firefighting?" Mark considered the question for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me misses it, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose. But I also realize now that my job isn't just about saving lives. It's about being present for the people who matter most, you and Mom." He reached out, pulling her into a hug. "No matter what happens, I'm not going anywhere without a fight." Though challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, the Dawsons faced them with newfound resolve. They couldn't control the mysteries surrounding Mark's resurrection, but they could choose how to live each day, with courage, love, and unwavering faith in one another. The weeks that followed Mark's appointment with Dr. Carter brought a sense of calm to the Dawson household, but it was a fragile peace, one held together by love, determination, and an unspoken agreement to focus on the present rather than dwell on the unknown. The nightmares didn't vanish entirely, nor did the occasional moments when Mark felt disconnected from reality. But these episodes became less frequent, almost as if writing in his journal helped him process the lingering fragments of whatever realm he had briefly touched. Emily continued to encourage him, often sitting beside him while he wrote, sketching pictures in her own notebook or humming softly under her breath. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Sarah placed a steaming pot of soup on the counter and glanced at Mark's open journal. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "maybe we should share some of this with others." Mark looked up sharply, his pen pausing mid-sentence. "Share what?" "Your story," Sarah replied gently. "Not all of it. Just enough to let people know you're okay, that we're okay. It might help put an end to the rumors and speculation." For a moment, Mark hesitated. Sharing their private struggles with the world felt like inviting chaos back into their lives, and he wasn't sure they were ready for that. But then he glanced at Emily, who nodded enthusiastically, and realized Sarah had a point. Rumors would continue to swirl unless they addressed them directly. More importantly, perhaps their story could offer hope to others facing loss or uncertainty. After much discussion, the family decided to hold a small gathering, not a press conference, but a quiet evening where close friends, neighbors, and a few members of the media could come together to hear their side of the story. They chose the community center as the venue, a place filled with memories of bake sales, holiday events, and fundraisers for local causes. It felt fitting somehow, a space that represented connection and support. On the day of the event, the Dawsons arrived early to set up. Emily helped arrange chairs in neat rows while Sarah pinned colorful paper stars to the walls, creating a warm and welcoming atmosphere. Mark stood near the podium, practicing what he planned to say, though his hands trembled slightly as he clutched his notes. When the doors opened, a steady stream of people filed in, some curious, others genuinely concerned. By the time everyone was seated, the room buzzed with quiet anticipation. When Mark stepped up to speak, the murmurs faded into silence. He took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of faces before him. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves swirling in his chest. "I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers about what happened to me, or why I came back. To be honest, there are days when I still don't fully understand it myself. But one thing I do know is that life is precious. Every single moment matters, whether it's spent laughing with your kids, holding your partner's hand, or simply watching the sun rise." He paused, glancing at Sarah and Emily, who sat in the front row, smiling encouragingly. "People keep calling my return a miracle, and maybe it is. But if it is, then it's not just about me, it's about us. About the bonds we share and the love that keeps us going even when things feel impossible. That's what saved me, more than anything else." As he spoke, tears welled up in the eyes of several attendees. One elderly woman dabbed at her cheeks, with a tissue, whispering to her husband, "He's right. Love really does conquer everything." Others nodded in agreement, moved by the sincerity in Mark's words. Afterward, during the Q&A session, questions ranged from practical, How are you feeling now? To philosophical. Do you believe in an afterlife? Mark answered honestly, admitting that he still had doubts and fears, but choosing to focus on gratitude rather than uncertainty. When someone asked if he planned to return to firefighting, he smiled wistfully and said, "That chapter of my life may be over, but I'll always find ways to help people. That's who I am." The gathering ended with hugs, handshakes, and heartfelt expressions of support. For the first time in months, the Dawsons felt truly seen, not as objects of curiosity or gossip, but as a family navigating extraordinary circumstances with courage and grace. As they packed up and headed home, Emily skipped ahead, twirling, under the streetlights. "That was fun," she exclaimed, grinning ear to ear. "Everyone was so nice." "It was," Sarah agreed, linking arms with Mark. "And you were amazing." Mark chuckled softly, squeezing her hand. "Let's just hope it quiets things down for a while. I'm tired of being the center of attention." In the weeks that followed, the media coverage shifted from sensationalism to reflection. Articles highlighted themes of resilience, faith, and the power of human connection, painting the Dawsons not as anomalies but as inspirations. Strangers sent letters and gifts, sharing their own stories of loss and healing. Some even claimed that hearing about Mark's journey had reignited their belief in miracles, or at least in the possibility of second chances. Yet, despite the newfound positivity, the family remained cautious. They turned down invitations to appear on talk shows or write books, preferring to keep their lives simple and private. Instead, they focused on rebuilding their routines: family dinners, weekend hikes, lazy Sunday mornings spent reading or playing, board games. These small, ordinary moments became their anchor, grounding them against the tide of uncertainty that still lingered at the edges of their existence. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the Dawsons gathered in their backyard to stargaze. Wrapped in blankets, they lay side by side on a patchwork quilt, pointing out constellations and making wishes on shooting stars. Emily snuggled close to her father, her head resting on his shoulder. "Daddy," she whispered, "do you think we'll ever see another miracle?" Mark gazed up at the vast expanse of sky, twinkling with countless pinpricks of light. "Maybe," he said softly, "but I think the real miracle isn't something we see. It's something we feel, like knowing you're loved, no matter what happens." Sarah reached over, taking his free hand in hers. "We'll always love you, Mark, no matter where you go or how long you stay." Her words hung in the air, carrying a weight that transcended fear or doubt. In that moment, surrounded by the people who meant everything to him, Mark felt a profound sense of peace. Whatever mysteries lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family. As the night deepened and the stars grew brighter, Emily yawned sleepily, curling closer to her parents. "I'm glad you're here, Daddy," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Even if I don't understand why, I'm just glad." Mark kissed the top of her head, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Me too, sweetheart, me too." Above them, a single shooting star streaked across the heavens, its brief brilliance lighting up the darkness before vanishing into the infinite beyond. The Dawsons watched it silently, each lost in their own thoughts yet united by a shared sense of wonder. Life, they realized, was full of unanswered questions, but it was also brimming with beauty, hope, and the boundless power of love. And for now, that was enough.